Hey there friends, Andrea Walford here from Make Beautiful Cards. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create this Give Thanks card featuring Stampin' Up's Autumn Greetings stamp set. Now this card features a gradient ink blocking technique. So the first thing I'm going to do is stamp the large image from Stampin' Up's Autumn Greetings stamp set onto a piece of Whisper White cardstock. Now I'm just working on a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch panel, and as you can see, I'm placing it on my Stamparatus. Now when you're working with a large image, sometimes when you're stamping it, you don't always get a perfect impression the first time. With the Stamparatus, it allows you to stamp the image as many times as you need to get a perfect impression. Now once the stamp is inked to my satisfaction, all I have to do is close the door of my Stamparatus and press down in order to transfer the image onto the cardstock piece. Now again, because it's a big image, you do want to make sure you apply pressure all over the entire surface of the image. Now you can see that I've lifted the door a couple of times to check on how clear the impression was, and I re-stamped it a few times until I got the image exactly how I wanted. Next, I want to die cut a stitched rectangle out of that image. So I have the third from the largest die from my stitched rectangle dies, and it's about 3 inches by 4 3/8 of an inch. And I'm positioning it over top of my image and then die cutting it. So my next step now is to add my gradient sponging. So the first thing I'm going to do is secure my cardstock piece onto my grid paper so it doesn't shift as I'm stamping. Now I want to create stripes of color, and I want to create a gradient out of them, going from lighter colors to darker colors, and I want earthy tones for all of them. So in order to do that, I need to be able to block off sections of my cardstock so I only apply color to the stripe or block that I'm working on. So for that, I'm using some stamping mask paper, and you can see I applied the stamping mask paper over top of my rectangle so that it was about 3/4 of an inch down from the top edge of that die cut rectangular piece. And the first color I applied was Daffodil Delight Classic Ink, and I applied it using a sponge dauber. Now for my second color, I'm going to need to mask 2 areas. I'm going to need to place one mask 3/4 of an inch below the edge of the first line, and then I need to cover up the yellow area that I sponged. Now when you place your mask over the yellow area, you do want to make sure that it doesn't completely cover the yellow, so you should see just a very little bit of the previous stripe. If you mask too close directly on top of that yellow line, you could end up with a white line in between your colors. So now the next color that I'm applying is my pumpkin pie, and once again I'm using a sponge dauber. Now when you're sponging with sponge daubers, it's very important that you apply very light pressure. So you tap your sponge dauber onto your ink pad, and then starting off your cardstock, you work in a circular motion, bringing your color onto your cardstock. And you keep repeating this as many times as you need to get the depth of color that you want. Now the next color that I'm going to be adding is Real Red. So once again, you can see I moved the bottom mask down by 3/4 of an inch again, and then I moved the top mask down so that it's not quite covering the border of the Pumpkin Pie Classic ink that I sponged on top. Now for each color, I'm just repeating that same process. I'm using my sponge dauber, patting it onto my ink pad, starting off the cardstock, and then bringing the color onto the cardstock area that's exposed in between the 2 masks. Now you'll find that with some colors you need to sponge a little more to get it to the depth that you want, and other colors you'll be able to add very little sponging to achieve the depth of color that you want. So now the next color that we're going to move on to is Terracotta Tile. So once again, I'm going to move my bottom mask so that it is 3/4 of an inch down from the bottom edge of the Real Red ink stripe. And then the top mask, I'm just placing over top of the Real Red ink, but making sure that I leave just the slightest little Real Red border showing. So my next color is going to be my Cajun Craze ink. Now I don't quite have enough room left in my cardstock piece to have 2 more 3/4 of an inch high stripes. So basically I'm just dividing the remaining area in half, once again using my mask paper. Now the Cajun Craze is a pretty intense color, so I don't have to apply too many layers to get that color to the depth that I want it to be. Now the final color that I'm going to be applying is my cinnamon cider, and at this point, because I'm at the very bottom of my rectangular cardstock piece, I only need to mask along the top line. And once again, you want to make sure that just the slightest bit of the previous color is showing below the edge of the mask paper. So with the cinnamon cider, it's a little bit of a lighter color than the Cajun Craze color, so I need to add a few more layers to get it to the depth that I want. So now that my cardstock panel has been sponged with that gradient of ink colors, my next step is going to be to create my greeting. So once again, I'm bringing back my Stamparatus platform, and I'm going to be stamping my greeting onto a piece of Cajun Craze cardstock. And the greeting I'm using is one that has multiple lines that says, "Give thanks with a grateful heart." So I'm securing my Cajun Craze cardstock in place. I'm laying my stamp where I want on the cardstock. I'm going to be die cutting it with a circle, so I want to make sure that there's enough area around it. And then before stamping, because I'm planning on heat embossing it, as you can see, I ran an embossing powder tool over top of my cardstock. Now, in order to get a nice, bright, bold white image, I'm stamping with white craft ink and then heat embossing with white embossing powder. Now my white craft ink pad is not super juicy, so I need to stamp the greeting multiple times in order to get the greeting to be nice and white. Next, I'm placing my cardstock piece over top of a coffee filter, and that's just to catch the excess embossing powder, and I've sprinkled on some white embossing powder. Next up is to melt the embossing powder with my heat tool, and I'm using my Stampin' Up! Heat tool on the number 2 setting. I'm holding it about an inch away from the surface of my stamped greeting, and I'm heating it from both the front and the back, and that's just to keep the cardstock as flat as possible. Now, once the embossing powder is completely melted, my next step is going to be to die cut this in a circular shape. And I'm using my stitch shape dies, the second from the smallest circle, and I'm simply die cutting it with my die cutting machine. So with all the elements of our card now finished, the next step is to mount that stamped and sponged panel onto our card front. Now the card is a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch note card created out of Whisper White thick cardstock. As you can see, I've liberally placed Stampin' Dimensionals along the back of that panel, and then I'm sticking it onto my card front on an angle, and I'm angling it towards the left of my card. Now I'm also planning on adding some Stampin' Dimensionals to my greeting circle because I want that to be popped up away from the stamped panel. So the first thing I'm going to do is where the edge of the circle is going to overlap my stitched rectangular panel, I'm placing a double layer of mini Stampin' Dimensionals. And I need a double layer to account for the layer of dimensionals behind the rectangular panel and then the layer of dimensionals behind the circle. So after placing some larger Stampin' Dimensionals on the back of my circle, I'm then sticking it down onto my card. And even though the stamped and sponged panel is on an angle, I'm positioning the greeting so that the greeting is actually straight. So my final step now is to embellish with some rhinestones, and I'm using my Champagne Rhinestone Basic Jewels. I'm placing a large and a small onto the greeting circle, and then I'm scattering a few additional rhinestones to the bottom right and top left of that greeting circle. Well, there you have it, friends. Our card is now finished. I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial and the gradient ink blocking technique. I look forward to creating with you again soon. See ya!